There's no surprise today that when we pay closer attention to the complication of the geopolitics, it's not only about the power struggle or the power imbalance, it's really about the two words, making sense. When we look at the imbalance in politics, another factor we need to consideration is about the gender equality. In fact, that more women around the world today are actively engaging in political movements and also in political contribution. However, it is one thing that we see the rise of the women leadership in politics, but it's another fact that some of the women today are living in fear when it comes to politics. And believe it or not, the data shows a third of women politicians in Sweden said the sexist hostility and intimidation made them consider giving up their posts. Almost half of believing women leaving office cited harassment and violence as a factor. And the majority of women in Australia said they were less likely to run for office after witnessing misogynistic attacks against the country's first woman prime minister. Keep in mind, this is not something new that just came out recently. It started to being paid more attention is simply because we're seeing that why the voices among women are so important. And so that's why in this episode, we're going to talk about all of them. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, Ms. Linda Robinson. Ms. Robinson is a senior fellow for women and foreign policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she writes about women's political and economic leadership, the relationship between gender equality and democracy. Author of this amazing book, Women in Power, Fighting for Democracy in an Age of Authoritarianism. This book spotlights the current cohort of women political leadership and tells the powerful stories of the women on the front lines of the battle between democracy and authoritarianism. Well, Ms. Robinson, and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Will. Happy to be with you.
Absolutely, Ms. Robinson. Such an honor to have you on our program. As I mentioned before, according to the data, not only that in Sweden, in Australia and also in Bolivia, we are seeing that more and more women today are very much interested in engaging in politics or political movements. But something that we still don't understand today is why more women today are still living in fear when it comes to leadership in politics. So, Ms. Robinson, from your perspective, by writing this book, can you help us to understand this fundamental information? What is happening today to women in politics, and why are we seeing this abandonment of the power in women leadership? Your thoughts?
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about what I think are some very important developments. Your introduction is great because it does note we've had growing women's representation over a number of decades. In fact, as democratization spread, there was increasing representation by women. But we've hit a peak now, it appears, looking at the data, and women's representation has stalled. And so I wanted to look at some of the reasons why, and looking at how political culture has been transformed. So I did find that really there's a narrative in many social movements, parties in various countries around the world that really is encouraging women to stay home, go back home, have children, focus on the family. There's also an upsurge in violent misogyny, which is really coming out of a distinct subset of individuals that are really preaching some very disturbing views about women, including about their right to vote and them as property, really very regressive and violent views. And a lot of both of those things are being propagated online in new ways, including the advent of generative artificial intelligence, which is manipulating women's images and a lot of targeted sexualized defamation that is really hurting women in the political space. Because of course, to be in politics today is to be online. It's very necessary. And it is, I think, a combination of those trends that's led us to kind of a plateau. And that's not to say women aren't persevering and still getting elected, but at lower rates. And I'll just mention two statistics to help quantify where we are right now. In terms of parliaments around the world, as a global figure, 27% of parliamentarians are women now. And that's an increase for over time, but it's really the stall has set in. And when you think about women are half of the population, that's still very far from a 50% level. Also, in terms of the presidents and prime ministers, and that's where I chose to focus my book, partly because the headwinds are greater for them. The higher you go, the more visible, the more these challenges appear. But also, it's the power of those offices and the ability of women leaders to affect positive change. So I really wanted to see both sides of the coin. That's a very small cohort. 7.5% of all presidents and prime ministers are women. That's a very, very tiny share of the number of offices, and it is down a bit from a peak of about 10%. So what we're facing is a lot of women do make it to the top, but I think we should be very concerned about what is preventing the historic incremental gains they've been having. Thank you.
Ms. Robinson, before we talk about any of the actors and political names that you cover in your book, I do want to touch another concept which is rather crucial, especially when we talk about the modern day politics. Take our country, for example. Again, you mentioned the word authoritarianism. And we're seeing that it's concerning not only for domestic, but also for international politics. But again, your book specifically talk about women in power, women in political leadership. What role does, or what factor does authoritarianism play when we are seeing this misogynist attack on women? Because we know that when we talk about democracy, I mean, again, it's no longer just a label on the ballot box. It's no longer just a campaign slogan. It's really a demand for actions, demand for changes. But when it comes to authoritarianism, where does this term fit in when we talk about women in politics? Why is this so essential and significant for us? Your thoughts?
Thank you. Thank you so much. And that is it's the backdrop of the entire book is really to bring to people's awareness that we're also in a long-term stall and what I call a democratic recession. If you look at the global worldwide trends, more countries are becoming autocratic than are going in a democratic direction. The Varieties of Democracy Index is one of the major trackers of this phenomenon. And right now, they say 92 countries are some form of autocracy and only 87 are in some form of democracy. And of course, that's a sliding scale because, of course, countries can be more or less democratic or autocratic. But it gives you a clear picture of the balance there. And what is happening with that, and the way I think it's so critical for people to understand the stalling of women's leadership as part of that, is a lot of the authoritarians are using these narratives about women, either because they have a misogynistic view of women or simply they want to eliminate the competition. So sidelining women is a useful tactic for maintaining and increasing their power. And that is really, I think, the worldwide drama that is playing out. And what I then focus on is who is defending democracy? Because obviously this is a trend that's really powered by people. So our people, as their democracies, are coming under challenge from external threats from authoritarians, and we do have countries that are trying very much to undermine and divide democracies internally and as a worldwide club of democracies, but also countries. The major form of autocratization today is occurring because populist leaders get elected and then they start eroding those basic norms of democracy: free and fair elections, separation of powers, rule of law, independent courts, all kinds of civil liberties, and including women's rights in that. So what you have is this hollowing out and degradation of democracy that we've seen in many countries that can be reversed, but it requires people to come forward and defend their democracy. And that's where I decided to really focus on some amazing stories of women. Despite the things directed at them, they are in the front lines of really defending democracy today.
Ms. Robinson, let's go to your book. Again, as I mentioned before, this is a fascinating read. As I pace myself, look at each character that you covered in this book, I want to talk about specifically about the Finland's former Prime Minister, Sanna Marin. I know she resigned denouncing the level of sexist attacks to which they were subjected. So, Ms. Robinson, let's talk about it from your perspective. I mean, again, someone like her, that she was so energetic and she was very young, and of course that as a politician that she carried herself in this more charismatic and also in this more pragmatic way. But few of us could understand, or few of us really understood what happened to her that eventually called her to resign. So walk us through someone like her experience. What happened to this female politician, and why was she the target in the midst of the political uncertainty?
Thank you. Yes, and I think that's a terrific story to focus on, because it really does have all the elements of what I'm trying to convey in the book. Sanna Marin, when she came and her party turned to her, she was a charismatic young leader, and when she became Prime Minister of Finland, the leader of her Social Democratic Party, she was the youngest leader in the world. So Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand had been the youngest, and then Sanna Marin, who was also young, was elected. And she actually, very interestingly, she came to government with a coalition of 5 parties, and all 5 parties were led by women. So this shows, in Finland, along with other Nordic countries, have always ranked high in the gender equality rankings in the world. So, but this was a notable and first ever accomplishment for Finland to have 5 women. So she composed her cabinet with those parties and had a number of ministers. She had many women ministers, but also male ministers. And there was a very important study done to really give data to what they were experiencing. Despite the progressive culture of Finland, they were still receiving much more gendered attacks, 10 times more than the men in her cabinet. So it was a very stark depiction that even when a country is more advanced, they're still being affected by this kind of sexist behavior. And it ran the gamut for her. She had, they were under question. There's a documentary people might want to see called The First Five, and it has some of their own stories that they're telling in the documentary. But she was constantly online, because as a young person she's there, and they had a lot of pushback online. It didn't deter them from going ahead and achieving many successes in government, both in the midst of the COVID pandemic, but also after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that really put Finland on alert as the country with the longest border with Russia. And she led the country to join NATO. So she understood the defense of Finland really required being part of this global NATO alliance to be more secure. So she was doing the job, but all along she was faced with a lot of this constant gendered pressure. And then a viral video that's very famous of her dancing at a private party, which shouldn't be called a scandal.
That's
There's
right.
nothing exceptional about that. And it just, the power of that, even though it's a minority attacking women in this way, it's really supercharged by viral media and technology. So that's really one of my messages is she was still popular. She won her election, but her other party members, her other coalition members did not win as many seats. So she was unable to form a majority government, and she decided not to join a coalition with a right-wing party. She really decided she was done. She wasn't going to just sit in parliament with an opposition, as a backbencher, as they say. So she went off to a career, an international career. She's very staunchly defending Ukraine. So she stepped out of the political role there in Finland, but she's young enough that I expect she'll make some kind of comeback in her coming years. But still, it's unfortunate that she was hounded in that way and felt, as she said publicly, and it's so important that women speak out about what they're experiencing. She said, "I'm done, I'm stepping out," and she came on stage to her last speech to the strains of Aretha Franklin's song Respect. And that was just kind of her, she was undaunted in her own sense of herself and her accomplishments. So she's a great story about both the bad side of what's happening, but the courage and accomplishments of those who do make it.
Well, Ms. Robinson, another perspective that we're seeing someone like her, in addition to the brevity in such a young, energetic female politician, but also you mentioned before that she's not saying that she's done for politics for good. So which means that there's still hope, there's still opportunity for her to rise in the near future, because again, we're seeing this imbalance in geopolitics. So that kind of leads to my next question. I mean, again, another character that I follow closely regarding when we talk about the activity in politics and also the role model in politics is the first woman president of Moldova. I mean, again, she's an unusual character as well. So my next question to you, Ms. Robinson, from another perspective, we know that those women were or are under attack because of the gender. But when we listen to the political rhetoric and when we listen to, I guess the word I'm trying to say, it's authenticity, because they do have authenticity. They do have identities in politics. So why isn't the authenticity working for them? So in other words, they're just being who they are. They're showing the best they could, and they're demonstrating the capabilities that they're able to shoulder the responsibilities. But again, as a male person or as a journalist or as a reader, I do want to ask the question is, why is authenticity not working for them? What are the reasons prevent them from moving forward or continue to receive those attacks?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, I think a short answer to your question is it really is this megaphone of the digital world that a minority of people can really damage and eclipse a very successful leader or cause such a toll. There's another leader I talk about in the Netherlands, and they also, universities are studying this and what's happening. She was receiving an attack of 1 every 15 seconds, and she stepped down. Sigrid Kaag is her name, but it was her children were very afraid because a lot of these violent threats, the police were having to guard her home. It just was turning into a nightmare that was damaging her family. And that's every woman's choice to decide when they personally unfortunately have to step out, but I write this book in order to show these are very successful women, and the minority of people attacking them and the way in which technology is amplifying it is a real problem and an unfair and dangerous phenomenon for democracies, because these leaders are as capable as any leaders around the world. You mentioned Maya Sandu, and I want to come back to that. So she is also an extremely, as you say, authentic leader. She's a very serious person. She's came into government first as a technocrat, was the Minister of Education, stopped a rampant cheating scandal, was really reforming from within. But the country was subjected. There's a lot of corruption in Moldova, a lot of it powered by networks connected with Russia, and she came into politics through a protest movement and was really quite determined, along with a lot of young people. And this is where my hope is, that people understand what gender abuse is, and young people are the most likely, I think, to lift up women and young candidates as change agents. So she came to power with her own party and with a coalition, and has been extremely successful. She has won election twice as president, first as prime minister, then twice as president, and that she was just reelected, and reelected by a majority. So she's a very strong leader. She has won. Her whole policy is geared around joining the European Union, because tiny Moldova, subjected to years upon years of hybrid warfare from Russia, really can't be secure without joining in the European Union. She's already met many of the conditions. She's reoriented the country's trade, energy, all of these things away from dependence on Russia and joining with Europe. So she has a plan for securing the country, and the country backs it. There is still a lot of opposition from Russia, which has constantly tried to undermine her, and they try to split the country. They use the Russian-speaking minorities, the Russian Orthodox Church. There's a lot of gendered abuse leveled at her. So I would say she's a case of someone who's really succeeding in the face of a mix of both sexist attacks, but also attacks against the country, and attempt to keep it in the Russian orbit and to keep it in a corrupt and dependent posture. It's now, I think, because they have started talks with the EU, they're on a path, I think a fairly hopeful path, that they will gain that security, and she'll probably go down as the historic figure of Moldova. But that doesn't mean she's not still subjected to all of this abuse that really shouldn't be happening.
Ms. Robinson, I have two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about, again, you mentioned all those international female politicians and role models, but let's talk about what's happening domestically in the US. I mean, again, we are also seeing that more women today are very much active in engaging politics. But it is still concerning to a lot of voters, and also concerning to a lot of citizens. I guess what we are saying, it's political interests and versus identity, or versus political identity. So, Ms. Robinson, from your perspective, I guess the question out there should be, what can the voters look for when we look at female politicians? I mean, because surely the female politicians don't want to be the copycat of someone else, and don't want to be sounded so, air quote, unauthentic just because of the political complication. So from your perspective, how can a female politician, or how can a woman balance in power when this person is actively seeking to making something right or healthier, prosperous for the country?
Thank you. And that really goes to the big theme of what I saw as I studied the leaders in office and the recent leaders around the world. There were some remarkable things that were coming up. And there's a great diversity. First of all, one should say women have all different political ideologies, just like men. I mean, this is the the fundamental point is none of these women are saying, elect me because I'm a woman. They are saying, elect me because I'm a good leader. I can help our country. And in fact, it's kind of offensive when these women, Santa Marin, to go back to her, in her memoir, she says, I'm not a woman leader, I'm a leader, period. So they're not asking for special treatment. And in fact, it's the attacks that are singling them out, saying they're unworthy or unqualified because they're women. So these women get elected really on the basis of their platform and what they're offering to the country. And what they're offering is really answers to these national security challenges. In the case of the ones that I really focus on with existential challenges that are either from Russia or from China, or existential challenges like climate change, international finance, the inability to access resources for growth, the structure of the international system. So these women are coming saying, I can defend the country and engage successfully with the rest of the world, but I'm also going to get to work on our domestic problems and repair the social safety net, ensure that people there's labor, education, childcare, all of the things that people need to be productive citizens. So it's governing for all. That's really what these women emphasize. They're not trying to just govern for a specific subset, and certainly not just for women. The women do, though, as we see, women are marginalized from the political landscape. They lift up women, they lift up minorities. In the case of Tsai Ing-wen, she doggedly fought for the Marriage Equality Act there. She fought for stronger sexual harassment laws. There are many things that you could do to lift up people who are marginalized in some way. And that's all about building a stronger society. It's not about being partial to one, but making sure everyone has a chance. And it's that, I think, blend of those two policies. And for the very small countries that many of these leaders come from, it's essential that they form those international coalitions, formal or informal, so they have a broad look toward the world and how they can bring their small country into a bigger supportive network. And that really is a success formula that any leader can adopt. And that's why I lift it up as really antidote for the bigger fight for democracy against the authoritarian trends.
And of course, Ms. Robinson, another person that came to my mind as you describe is the current Japanese Prime Minister Takeichi. And of course that she has a lot more stories to tell. Well, Ms. Robinson, I do want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, the book is called Women in Power, Fighting for Democracy in an Age of Authoritarianism. What would you expect the readers to appreciate and understand when we finish reading the last chapter of this book? Because that we know, as I mentioned in the intro, it's beyond the complication or the intricacy of the politics. It's beyond what we talk about, the social movement, the cultural movement. It's all above that. But again, you are the author, you're the expert. So Ms. Robinson, from your perspective, what is your simple expectation from the readers when we finish reading your book, your final thoughts?
Well, I hope that people who read the book actually feel inspired to get involved right now. I think democracies are really a participation sport, and citizens need to be willing to step into the political arena. I very much hope younger people, women and men, will get into the political arena, because I think that is the definition of the future, for people being willing to stand for office. And it doesn't have to be your entire career. It's a public service that you can do for a period of time and step out. So my hope is that people are actually inspired. They see the big challenge facing the world today, and democracy is a form of government in which change is possible if people get together and decide what's needed. And I think hopefully they'll see these women should be considered as equally or more capable of governing as men, and break down that prejudice. It is not saying we only need women to lead. We need everyone to be able to step up and be in the competition.
That's right, and I agree with you 100%. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Miss Linda Robinson. Again, Ms. Robinson, she's the Senior Fellow for Women and Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. And I strongly encourage everyone to go online, check out this amazing book, Women in Power, Fighting for Democracy in an Age of Authoritarianism. Well, Ms. Robinson, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to explore more interesting topics. And thank you so much for doing this.